The UFC under Dana White and TKO is low-key ran like a fascist dictatorship.
Who the fuck starts a conversation like that? I just sat down.
Now, if you look at Mussolini when he was running Italy, when the Mustache Man, when the Austrian painter, when German Voldemort was leading Germany, you will find a lot of similarities between the UFC and how they're moving and a fascist regime. And I know this may sound crazy. People are going to say, oh, you're just a woke lib, dude. You just can't call everything fascist. Now, if we go over the 14 principles of fascism as written by Lawrence Britt, which is heavily referenced, we will find if we build this brick by brick, low-key, there's a lot of similarities. Real quick though, this video was inspired by Michael Mockler, who made the 10 principles of fascism used by the NBA. Please watch his video first because I literally was inspired to make this idea because of him, and his video was really good. So please go watch his video either after mine, or you can pause mine and just go watch his. His video is probably better anyway, to be honest.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Shout out to Michael who gave me permission to make this video. So here we go. The first characteristic of fascism: powerful and continuing nationalism. Fascist regime, they tend to make constant use of patriotic mottos, slogans, songs, paraphernalia. Flags are seen everywhere. Point is, the country, the nation is above all. It's above the individual. It's above everything else. It is the most important thing, and it must be emphasized everywhere. And how the UFC does this, metaphorically speaking, think about it like this. At one point, for the longest time, the idea of custom shorts makes no sense. You wore whatever you wanted. You had the Iceman shorts. You had the Tito Fireman shorts. You had whatever thing you could think of, right? I know some of the short designs back in the day were a little bit ass. You know, you had to do an Speedo and whatnot. Ass. But regardless, right? UFC comes in with the Reebok deal, then the Venom deal. They strip away fighters' abilities to express themselves. Every fighter needs to look the same. Now, people are going to say, whoa, dude, they actually do get custom shorts. Come on, bro. Not really. You had people who were getting mad at Khalil Roundtree for getting custom shorts when that's an oxymoron. Fighters used to be able to make 6 figures off of their sponsors. UFC took that away because the brand is what's more important. The UFC on the canvas gets to have some weird red pill adjacent sponsor all over the cage, and then Bruce Buffer has to make a super dumb long intro saying insert blah 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 blah, and then he gets to introduce the fighters afterwards. That's all cool, but God forbid a fighter get their own sponsorship and the UFC can't get a cut of it.
That's fucking illegal.
Because it's all about the sport. It needs to look cleaner and it needs to be uniform. And then you have fans parroting this stuff. That's when I say aspects of nationalism are creeping into the UFC. If you take a look at the UFC 300 poster, right, which is arguably the biggest event in UFC history, it's one of the most iconic, if not the most iconic, right?
Bro, I don't know.
On the official poster, there's no fighters on there. Go and check right now. You think I'm making this up? You don't see Alex, you don't see Jamal, you don't see Jean Willie, you don't see nobody. It is just a regular branded logo of UFC 300. You know why? The message is right there in front of you. They don't want you to think the fighters are what make the brand. They don't want to think it's the fans. It's the UFC. The literal 3 letters is what people should adore. Just like the fascist regime, it's not about the worker. It's not about the citizen. It's not about the people. It's about the symbol. It's about the flag. It's about the idea that the nation, that the identity under this nation, under this fascist regime is what's supreme. But the reason why this national identity is so important for the UFC is because they know if the fighters collectively understand that they are what makes up the UFC, not the 3 letters, not the brand, the UFC would dissolve as we understand it, as we know it. They don't want another Conor McGregor.
Where the fuck is everyone?
Because they know if Conor McGregor, his contract runs out and he goes out and starts his own thing, that's threatening. Literally, if all the fighters collectively said, you know what, we're not going to fight until we get our demands met, things would change. But when you just feed into the brains of them, that's the UFC, it's UFC or bust. The UFC is what's really important, nothing else. Fighters do not stay vigilant. Principle number 2, disdain for human rights. Because of fear of enemies and the need for security, the people in fascist regimes are persuaded that human rights can be ignored in certain cases because of the need. The people tend to look the other way or even approve of things such as torture, summary executions, assassinations, long incarcerations of prisoners, etc. Under a fascist regime, human rights, we not really rocking with that, right? How does this relate to the UFC? Let's start off with the low-hanging fruit. The UFC's willingness to do business with regimes who constantly violate human rights. Saudi Arabia, UAE, United Arab Emirates, Abu Dhabi, Fight Island, whatever you want to call it.
We getting there at money.
The UFC loves to talk about how Fight Island, it saved the company. We talk about how during the pandemic, they're the only sport in town, the only sport running on TV, and Fight Island is a huge contributor to that. Yeah, look at what the UAE is doing over in Sudan.
That's fucking illegal.
Just putting it out there, right? The Trump administration with the White House event, for those who live in the U.S. and understand what's really going on, yeah, that's also sports washing too. It's not just sports washing when it's oil money. It also counts with the U.S. as well, Qatar, and so on. The UFC has time and time again shown they've drawn their line in the sand that they do not care about human rights. As long as that money's coming in, you can do whatever, bro.
I'm not here to make friends, I'm here to make money.
And the same thing even extends to the fighters. And when it comes to the UFC having abusers on the roster, they just don't care. They got pretty much an all-tolerance policy from what it looks like. I mean, John Jones can put a 3-piece combo on his wife, and that somehow was less controversial than him ducking Tom Aspinall. That's when Dana White was like, man, I don't know if I can have John in the White House. But when John, allegedly, by the way, put hands on his wife, it was, oh man, but he's still the GOAT. He's just so complicated, man. When he did a hit and run on a pregnant lady, they're using that to be, John, he's just so complex, man. He just can't get out of his own way, man. It's just he's going through a tough time, man. We've got to understand him. No! He's a terrible person. The UFC went out of their way to sign Greg Hardy, who wasn't even like that good. You didn't even need to sign Greg Hardy. And we know Greg Hardy primarily, not even for football, but for being a domestic abuser. And the UFC just goes well, but I mean, it's the fight business, man. People can like it or not. People are still talking about when is Carter going to come back, man. That man was held civilly liable for SA. He violated another woman. And you got people who will look you dead in the eye and talk about, oh man, but dude, I hope Conor gets his life together, man. I hope, he can get back in the cage soon. What? If that was your wife, if that was your daughter, it shouldn't even have to be your daughter, your sister, anybody. That's another person. But the UFC and even the fan base, they don't care about this stuff. They don't care about people being the worst of the worst. John Jones and Conor McGregor could literally slime out Dana's family, and Dana will be sitting here like,
is he fucking awesome?
Man, the kid, I can't wait to see that kid back in there, man. I think he's a very complicated individual, but at the end of the day, it's the fight business. Number 3, the identification of enemies and scapegoats for a unifying cause. So a lot of the time under a fascist regime, what you need is a scapegoat. You need a common enemy so that the people can rally together, and none of the problems are because of the government or other external factors. It's about those people. They're the reason why things are the way they are. And you need to identify them as the enemy in order to make us better. And you know what the UFC does? They do this to the fighters, and they do this with boxing, and they do this with the media. Let's start off with boxing, right? Anytime the fighter pay conversation comes up of, hey, Dana, are the fighters going to get more money? Hey, Dana, why doesn't this fighter get X, Y, Z amount of money, right? Dana always goes, oh, well, look at boxing. It's always a going out of sale business. And oh my gosh, look at boxing. They overpay those guys. Those guys get less motivated, and they don't always make the big fights. They can't make the fights like we do. The best don't fight the best in boxing. When literally, we want to talk about the best fighting the best, you got Diego Lopez fighting Volk again. You got Paddy Pimblett fighting Justin Gaethje. UFC can't make John Jones fight either Francis or Tom Aspinall. Can't make Ilya versus Islam. Whole time boxing got better Biev and Biyov to fight twice. 2 times. You got Tank Davis fighting Garcia. You got Haney fighting Ryan Garcia. You got Shakur Stevenson about to fight Tio. The UFC hasn't made a better card in 2025 than what boxing did with Bivol and Biev. They didn't. They did not. That's just the honest truth. And the UFC knows that the MMA fan base has this disdain for boxing, because I'm not going to lie. boxing fans and the boxing media are very posh. They're very bougie. They look down on MMA. They're like, man, that's a redneck, you know, skinhead sport. I get it. You know, boxing fans can be very posh. But let's not act as if, like the UFC, the same things they accuse boxing of, they're not doing the same thing. You want to talk about, oh, the best will fight the best? Who has Patty Pimblett fought to get a title shot?
I am the most entertaining lightweight on the planet.
Movsar and Lerone Murphy, who should be fighting Volk right now, could have fought him way long ago, by the way. We were going to do in Diego versus Volk 2. Ew. And how the UFC spends it on the fighters is, think about it like this. Anytime a fighter's in negotiations, what does Dana White say if there's a little bit of a little bit of turbulence between two fighters? He picks out one fighter in particular and goes, oh, the kid didn't want to fight. The kid didn't want to fight. He or she didn't want to fight. They were scared. They were ducking. They didn't want to fight. They didn't want to fight. You hear it all the time. There's so many numerous examples that I can just clip it in here. How many times Dana White has said this about somebody, right?
They didn't want to fight.
I don't know if those guys really want that fight. You know what I mean?
Tom didn't want to continue in the fight. So.
On top of this as well, Arman Tsarukyan, who should be fighting for the lightweight interim belt right now. No ifs and buts about it. But then it goes, well, but look at Arman, man. That kid, he messed things up. He screwed up. He's still earning his way back. I don't care what the ranking says, right? And you have fans parroting this. Y'all will have no problem with Conor throwing the dolly at the bus. But Arman, God forbid, Arman gets injured and Arman headbutts somebody, which those things are not okay. But let's not act like we're drawing this fine line. Let's not act like we're doing that, because we don't keep that same energy. And then on top of it, the main thing I want to bring up is I want to go back to the Leon versus Bilal card. If you remember, I don't believe there was rarely any bonuses given out for that card, if very little. But the issue was Dana White was saying, you know what? I upped the bonuses and the fights were still boring. So the fighters just don't get more motivated if you give them more money. So I'm not going to do it again, ever again. I'm never going to raise the bonuses again. Despite the fact he had the UK fighters fighting at like 2 a.m. You had UK fighters and the UK fans have to flip their sleep schedules, and you're wondering why there was less action on the card. Maybe it's not that the fighters are lazy and the fighters just don't get more motivated if you pay them more in bonuses, which aren't guaranteed. You know, maybe it just has something to do with the fact that you have fighters fighting at 3 or 4 a.m. That's not normal, Dana. But guess what? People hear that one clip and then go, see, look, that's why we shouldn't raise bonuses. Because they're using the fighters as a scapegoat, even though the UFC themselves made that problem. We've had UK cards, we have overseas cards that start at a different time, doesn't accommodate the American fans, because it's not normal to compete at those times in the day, Dana.
I'm tired, Alfred.
Number 4, supremacy of the military. Even when there are widespread domestic problems, the military is given a disproportionate amount of government funding and the domestic agenda is neglected. Soldiers in military service are glamorized. And the UFC literally sponsored the military parade, bro. The Trump military parade, they literally sponsored it. They've always got those little things that they do at certain parts of the year where they got the fighters in the black room. They kind of sit over like this and they're like, you know, I'm so grateful for the troops, man. You know, I love it. And I'm not saying you have to hate that or that's a bad thing. It's very similar to what the NFL does. But even a lot of the sponsorships as well that the UFC aligns itself with, very military adjacent. So again, not saying you have to hate this, but this is a characteristic, just saying. Number 5, rampant sexism. Now, this one is a bit of a tricky one, right? Because we're talking about the MMA community as a whole, bruh. One of the most sexist sports communities by far. I mean, if you're a woman, trans woman of any sort, and you engage in the MMA community, you could have any take, whether if it's good or bad, you are going to get the most misogynistic rhetoric by far. Or if you're a trans woman, you're going to get crazy transphobic rhetoric. It's just a part of the game, and it's unfortunate, and that should change, and that's not acceptable. But if we're talking about the UFC specifically, here's where it gets tricky, right? Because on one hand, you can make a strong argument that the UFC, being a very male-dominant organization, how they have treated the women's divisions is low-key sexist. Let's keep it a buck, y'all. Kayla Harrison versus Amanda Nunes is arguably the second or the most important fight in women's history in terms of like the fighters included, the greatness, the legacy. It's literally one of the biggest fights of all time in women's history. And it's a co-main event to Patty Pimblett and Justin Gaethje. Now, some people will say that's not sexist because more people want to see Gaethje versus Pimblett, which maybe, maybe not. But then my whole angle with this is that Dana White did not care about women and didn't really want women in the sport, to be honest, until Ronda Rousey came along. If Ronda Rousey wasn't his cash cow that Dana White could hone in on, I mean, literally, run the tape, bro, when Dana White literally said that women will never fight in the UFC.
No.
When are we gonna see women in the UFC, man?
Never.
Anytime soon? Never?
Never.
So with that being considered, I feel as if also how the UFC just has pretty much an all-tolerance policy when it comes to domestic violence towards women. I mean, you've got John Jones and Conor McGregor, two poster children, whatever, of domestic abuse and violence towards women, and many others. The UFC, frankly, I don't think cares that much about women's rights or how this makes women feel. I mean, literally, there was a controversy where Greg Hardy was on the same card placement as Rachel Ostovich, who is a domestic violence survivor. And when the media was like, yo, Dana, do you think it's a little crazy that you have Greg Hardy, a guy, you know, who's known for beating women, and Rachel Ostovich, you know, who is a domestic violence survivor, they're fighting on the same card? And he goes like, well, she's not upset about it. She's not complaining. Why are you guys bringing that up? And it's like, dude, Dana, yo, dude, it's a valid question, dude. It's a valid question. And now people are going to bring up Dana hitting his wife. It's a whole other can of worms, but yeah. Number 6, controlled mass media. Sometimes the media is directly controlled by the government, but in other cases, the media is indirectly controlled by government regulation or sympathetic media spokespeople and executives. Censorship is very, very common, especially in wartime. And this literally is one of the biggest things we can point out about the UFC. People often go like, why are press conferences so dry? Why do they suck? The reporters go like, hey, Max, what would it mean if you got to fight in Hawaii? Wouldn't that be cool? Or, hey, Dustin, you know, do you want to get a win in your hometown? Do you want to win? The reason why press conferences are dry by design, and then some people complain about Nina Drama, which I don't think there's that much of an issue with her in terms of her media presence, but that's a whole different discussion. But I feel as if, not even I feel as if, I know as if the reason why we're in this position is in order to get media credentials, you need to be an NPC and you cannot rock the boat in any way, shape, or form. I mean, take Aaron Helwani, who got blacklisted. Now, there's a controversy. Should he have leaked the Brock Lesnar news early? Should he have not? As a journalist, you know, you can make the argument if you have something, it's your duty to report it, but that's a whole different discussion. Point is, Aaron Helwani, probably the biggest voice in MMA media. The reason he's not there at the events, because Dana White makes his life a living hell if he ever shows up there, right? You got guys like Luke Thomas who probably are not going to be welcomed with open arms at a UFC event, right? On top of this, any reporter that even asks a question, like, for example, lady asked John Jones, hey, John, so isn't it crazy that, like, the event got moved from state to state because you tested positive? And then John just gets go like, I don't like your question, lady. Or when John Jones went to Luke Thomas said, Luke, I don't like you. I'm not going to answer your question, right?
I don't really like you, Luke, so I'm not going to answer your question.
And also to circle back real quick to the Rachel Ostovich, Greg Hardy situation, where Greg Hardy, again, known for beating the sonic coins out of his girl, and Rachel Ostovich being a domestic violence survivor, the UFC PR team literally approached the media right before the press conference was going to start and told them no non-fighting questions may be asked, which is a peculiar request. That is controlled media right there. That is a valid question to ask. Why are you putting a dude who's known for domestic violence on the same card as a woman who's a domestic violence survivor? It's a valid question, but that's how it gets. And then let's just also talk about, again, that whole situation where Dana White slapped his wife. And again, ESPN being in partners with the UFC gave him softball coverage. I mean, Stephen A. Smith basically hit him with the, you know, man, it's just complicated. You know, it's just like they softballed him because there's a huge conflict of interest. I mean, Brett Okamoto, a lot of the people that work for the UFC media, they cannot independently, they can't objectively cover the sport because the UFC They're just controlling them like puppets, just like how the Austrian painter Mussolini was controlling the media. Number 7, obsession with national security. Fear is used as a motivational tool by the government to control the masses. And I'm going to be honest, the UFC, despite being known as the Wild Wild West in a lot of ways, does have a very big emphasis on national security. I mean, look at the contract system at first. The way the contracts are structured, pretty much straight exclusivity, despite the fighters being independent contractors, right? Even if you're retired, if you want to go do a celebrity boxing match, Dana's got to approve it. Don't even ask the UFC to go co-promote with anybody. If you're a fighter and you want to go fight in a different promotion, let's say there's somebody, aka Randy Couture and Fedor, you got someone who's potentially one of the biggest stars in the sport, you want to go fight Fedor? That ain't gonna happen under Dana's watch.
So what would I do? Co-promote the Ken Shamrock Hoist Gracie fight with them or something?
But the purpose of this national security is mainly due to the fact that the UFC wants to protect the brand, as they are MMA. They don't want anyone else even getting a piece of the pie.
One shitty organization that sells no tickets and nobody watches buys another shitty organization that sells no tickets and nobody watches. Sounds like a fucking winner to me, boy.
So that's why people often go, why doesn't the UFC co-promote with one championship, Ryzen, PFL? Because the UFC, for one, doesn't need to, but also they want to secure the product. They want to secure the dominance, the chokehold they have on the sport. That's why anytime a fighter does a grappling match, boxing match, we saw this with Francis Ngannou, who said, hey, if I'm going to be an independent contractor, why can't I go box Tyson Fury? You ain't go box if I say so.
One of the greatest heavyweight boxers of all time going in against one of my MMA guys. We saw this movie before.
Now, Conor was the exception, not the rule. And speaking of Conor, one aspect of national security, which I will say might have been a little bit of a boss move by Dana, when Conor skipped out on UFC 200 media, Dana said, nope, I'm pulling you from the card. Which seems a little crazy to think in today that you would pull Conor from arguably the biggest card of all time at the time. But Dana White said, look, you're going to do it by the book. If you skip out on media, if you do things the wrong way, if you do something I do not like, I'm pulling you. I don't care who it is. Go ask Dan Hardy what happened when he started yelling at Herb Dean.
If you work for me and you approach a judge or a referee or any type of official, I will fire you.
Number 8, religion and government are intertwined. Governments in a fascist nation tend to use the most common religion in the nation as a tool to manipulate public opinion. Religious rhetoric and terminology is very common from government leaders, even when the major tenets of that religion oppose the actual government's policies or actions. And I'm not going to lie, you could look at the UFC sort of like a religion, and Dana White kind of is presented as this godlike, infallible figure.
What?
I mean, think about it like this, right? Dana White, it's always whatever Dana says, it's true, it's got to be true. If Dana White said the kid didn't want to fight, then the kid didn't want to fight, right? Dana White can in one breath say, hey, you know, John Jones, if I saw Francis Ngannou, what he just did, I'd move down to 185. And then next thing, it's, oh, well, Francis Ngannou went to PFL because he didn't want the tough fights. Dana White can say, oh, Arman Tsarukyan versus Dan Hooker, it's a number one contenders fight. The winner is going to fight for the belt. Then in the same breath, oh, I don't care about what the ranking says. Paddy Pimblett versus Justin Gaethje is going to fight. And Arman, yeah, he's still got to earn his way up. I don't care. That kid, he screwed up. And guess what? He contradicts himself all the time. But guess what, though? Because Dana White, he is this high being within this ecosystem, within this religion that is the UFC. You can't question him. I mean, look at the way fighters literally get on their knees and beg for 50 G's. They are begging for money, almost like they are begging to be saved, that they need their savior, Dana White, to pull them out of poverty, to pull them out of their bad situation. I mean, you got Hanacho Moicano saying he's not going to take settlement money because he made a deal with the UFC and the UFC's giving him so much. And our Cowboy Cerrone literally didn't negotiate for a better contract against Conor McGregor, which should have been his biggest payday ever. Because, you know, man, I just got to do what the UFC says. I'll take whatever fight they give me. Trust me, bro, religious rhetoric heavily is paralleled with how the UFC operates. At number 9, corporate power is protected. And I mean, come on, bro. The UFC now with TKO, Man, where do I even start? I mean, for one, the UFC has already been sued numerous times for antitrust business practices, but particularly for operating as a monopoly, which is a little bit different than monopoly. And monopoly is when there is a market with one buyer controlling the demand. So one person or entity that is heavily controlling the buying power, which allows for them to lower the prices, which affects the price of labor. And I mean, look at the UFC buying out WEC, buying out Strikeforce, buying out all of these organizations and just basically taking out the market. At this point, the buying power and the real ability for fighters to collectively bargain and to actually advocate for themselves is in a really, really bad spot. I mean, the UFC just paid out millions and millions of dollars in a settlement in one of their lawsuits. On top of that, the way the UFC operates inherently would be illegal in boxing. I mean, under the Ali Act, the UFC cannot operate. The fact that the UFC can be the promoter, can hold the title, and can also match make, this would not fly in boxing because there are so many conflicts of interest, and the UFC just has an unnatural control over the fighter's bargaining ability. And I think the issue is also the UFC is literally trying to bring in the Ali Revival Act, where they are lobbying for this to be passed so they can now enter into the boxing market, because they know under the boxing rule set, they cannot compete. They want fighters not to have the ability to have this ceiling where they can make as much money as they can possible. They want all hands on deck. And I mean, the last thing I'll say is, in terms of corporate power being protected, notice how when Dana, goes, to his wife, no repercussion. But again, he's at the top of the food chain because corporate power is protected. At number 10, labor power is suppressed. I mean, one of the most egregious examples is the fact that fighters cannot wear sponsorships on their shorts unless they're approved by the UFC. So that's sometimes why you see some fighters with a little monster logo on the shorts. But the UFC, they can put the canvas on with whatever they want, but fighters can't wear custom shorts. And before, it was always to make the UFC more uniform and to make it look more professional. But it's taken out a huge revenue source for fighters. I mean, Brandon Schaub, a fighter like Brandon Schaub, said he was making 6 figures off of sponsorships. And it makes sense. I mean, if you're a sponsor and you get to put something on the shorts where, the UFC is being viewed by so many people, that is a huge, huge, huge money source for fighters. And that was just taken away by the UFC. And fans will go, oh, well, it makes the sport look cleaner, or, oh, well, fighters just can't look like that. It looks ugly. But we see this in so many other major sports where that's not even an issue. Now, many of you probably heard the story of Francis Ngannou, obviously, of how Francis Ngannou took on the UFC and Dana White pretty much hates his existence. Same thing with Randy Couture as well. But one story that gets left out is Leslie Smith, who led something called Project Spearhead back in 2018. Back in 2018, Project Spearhead was a fighter-led union drive spearheaded by Leslie Smith, in which she began collecting authorization cards to petition the National Labor Relations Board for employee status. In response to this, the UFC released her immediately after she won her fight, by the way, refused to re-sign her, which pretty much ended her UFC career right then and there. And she said, once the UFC retaliated against me, people stopped signing cards, and the UFC created this climate of fear. Number 11, disdain for intellectuals and the arts. And I think this, again, goes into the whole scapegoat thing that we talked about earlier. Let's take, for example, what happened at the Canelo versus Crawford press conference, which Sean Zittle asked Dana White, hey, Dana White, the whole Ali Revival Act, is going to heavily, heavily negatively affect the fighters. Why are you trying to spearhead this type of legislation? And Dana White, instead of just answering the question, called him a scumbag and basically insulted him because he wasn't in that regular UFC environment where the reporters are giving him softball questions. I mean, the way the UFC operates, it operates on this idea that the intellectuals and the media, they don't know what they're talking about. They've never been in the fight business. It's just a bunch of scumbags who are just trying to take us down. When in reality, all he did was ask you, bro, why are you trying to change fundamentally the business of boxing so that you guys can come in instead of just operating fairly like everybody else?
What? We're flying to Philadelphia! Oh, hell no!
During COVID-19, when the UFC was pretty much the first major sport to get back into action, there was a lot of questions on the safety and the ethics of it. Kevin Draper, a New York Times reporter, was covering the situation, and Dana White was so upset with him just genuinely trying to ask some valid questions, he referred to him as a dickhead. And this is what I mean for the disdain for the intellectuals. And just think about the numerous times that Dana White has just pretty much verbally assaulted Ariel Helwani for Aaron Helwani being, again, one of the few reporters who doesn't just kiss the ring.
When you say that you're going to take care of Yoel Romero, what do you mean by that? Can you elaborate? What does that mean?
That's between me and Yoel Romero.
Well,
Thanks for asking. That's between us.
No, but there's the precedent with Carlos Condit and GSP where...
Is there? There's really not a precedent. There's different scenarios and different situations. Don't worry about what Yoel Romero's going to make. Me and Yoel will take care of that.
All right.
Number 12, obsession with crime and punishment. And under fascist regimes, police power and this idea of law and order is just heavily, heavily emphasized. Now, the UFC is inconsistent with this, but they use this as a tool to control the fighters. I mean, take Arman Tsarukyan, for example, again. Now, whether if he missed weight or if he threw out his back trying to impress Nina Drama, who's to really know what happened? Only Arman truly knows what happened. However, what I will say is this whole stance that Dana White has went on, saying, oh, Arman Tsarukyan, he screwed up an event. The kid, he's headbutting Dan Hooker. You know, obviously, again, Arman did also go punch him. Like, he has done some off-the-wall things. Like, he has not helped his case. Like, you could call Arman a thug. That is a valid take you could have. However, the only reason why Arman Tsarukyan gets labeled this way and Dana White wants to make an example out of him is because, truth be told, Arman Tsarukyan is not a star compared to Ilia Topuria, and he is the biggest threat to Ilia Topuria. And if Arman Tsarukyan takes that belt away from Ilia Topuria or from a Paddy Pimblett, the UFC's bottom line is affected. They use this as a control tool. Take Muhammad Mokaev, who, I'll be honest, did himself no favors, had controversies with Manel Kape, allegedly was rude towards UFC staff. But what didn't help was that, to be frank, he wasn't the most entertaining fighter. So the justification for letting Muhammad Mokaev go was, well, he was hard to work with and he was a troublemaker when, again, we have Conor McGregor, who literally got fighters not able to fight because he took a dolly and threw it at the bus and cut Michael Chiesa open. But at the end of the day, this obsession with law and order and crime and punishment, it just uses a tool to punish fighters who do not have Dana White privilege.
I'm gonna be real. You got this shit handed to you. You got Dana White privilege.
All right, so Jay low-key did not record himself saying the full principle, so Editor Hendricks is here to save the day. Don't worry. So principle number 13, rampant cronyism and corruption. Jay, I hope you're paying me extra for this.
Fascist regimes are almost always governed by groups of friends and associates who appoint each other to government positions and governmental power to protect each other. And the UFC is no different. First, let's talk about the MMA managers. You know that infamous clip of Aljamain Sterling basically being gaslit by the UFC to take the fight against Sean O'Malley, despite the fact that Aljamain Sterling was just not ready to fight. He just was not 100% recovered. And you had Hunter Campbell telling him, listen, man, look, think about how big of an opportunity this is for you. You got to do it.
It's just this opportunity for you to take his audience that he has built in and introduce you to them. But instead of using the platform and the increased media coverage, it's almost like you're working against it.
And if you notice, there's this one bald guy with a beard who's just sitting there pretty much saying nothing. And some of you may be inclined to wonder, what is this guy even doing? Like, what is he there for? You know who that is?
No.
That is MMA manager Tiki Gost, who, guess what, is buddy-buddy with the UFC brass. You know, isn't it a bit interesting that you have managers like Tiki Gost and Jason House who have a good amount of the roster, and Ali Abdelaziz, who have really good working relationships with the UFC, and about 80% of the UFC roster is pretty much signed by 5 different agency firms, 5 different agency companies. Do you think there might not be some conflict of interest where you have Jason House, who's buddy-buddy with one of the matchmakers, Sean Shelby, and you have Tiki Gost, who has a good working relationship with the UFC brass, that maybe the fighters are not always going to be the best interest for these managers? And why is it that the UFC has seemingly somehow had majority of the roster, 80% of it, all signed under just 5 different entities? And the other thing we'll touch on is Dana White privilege. I mean, Conor McGregor can do no wrong. Sean O'Malley can do no wrong. Unlimited title shots for Diego Lopez, yada, yada, yada. But one example that I think does get lost with time a bit is back in 2016 when Brock Lesnar, when he was making his return for UFC 200, at the time, there was about a 6-month period, give or take, where you had to be in the USADA testing pool. But Brock Lesnar basically got a free pass to fight Mark Hunt without being in the USADA testing pool. And guess what happened after the fight took place? Yup, Brock Lesnar failed his test because it's Brock Lesnar. Duh. And the UFC knew exactly what Brock Lesnar was. And Mark Hunt got screwed. He got screwed because at the end of the day, Dana White and them, they saw dollar signs and Brock Lesnar, that's their boy. So they let him cheat. They willingly knew that Brock Lesnar was going to cheat. And they let it go anyway because UFC 200 got to make that money. And UFC 200, to be fair, was not as good as it was supposed to be, with a lot of the fights not materializing. Lastly, number 14, fraudulent elections and fake meritocracy. And I mean, the UFC, the ranking system, the idea that the best fight the best in the UFC, unlike boxing, is a lie. They put up this ranking system and they tell you, hey, you know what, like the rankings matter, you know, you gotta work your way up and yada, yada, yada. Where you have Sean Brady literally saying he was told by the UFC, they don't care about the ranking.
As far as I know, and you guys talked about it yesterday in your show, the UFC isn't guaranteeing, they're not saying any fight is a number one contender fight anymore. Like that's not a thing that they're doing. Like
the rankings are just simply a tool. Arman Tsarukyan, who is the rightful number one contender, Dana White even said with his own lips, out of his own mouth, Dan Hooker versus Arman Tsarukyan is a number one contenders fight.
Earlier this week, you scheduled Arman Tsarukyan to fight Dan Hooker in November.
Yeah.
And will the winner of that fight become the number one contender in the lightweight division?
Will the number of that? Yeah. Yeah.
Arman Tsarukyan weighs in as a backup and beats a top 5 contender. Guess what? Patty Pimblett, Justin Gaethje title shot. You got 50-year-old Dan Henderson, who wasn't even top 10, fighting in a title shot against Michael Bisping. And in the most egregious example recently, you've got Lerone Murphy.
It wouldn't be a Zombie Man J video if he wasn't talking about Lerone Murphy deserving a title shot.
On a 10-fight unbeaten streak, the UFC loves to say, we love risk takers. We love people who put it out on the line. Risked everything to fight Aaron Pico, who if Aaron Pico would have won that fight, would be fighting Volk right now. Lerone Murphy goes out there and knocks him out. Diego Lopez title shot. Movsar, again, a rightful number one contender as well, who beat Diego Lopez, by the way, and is beating Aljamain Sterling and Arnold Allen. Again, a guy who was long overdue for a title shot, but guess what? Not a needle mover in the eyes of the UFC. So at the end of the day, when people talk about the rankings, it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, the rankings are just giving you an illusion of choice. That's all it is. They took Leon out the rankings for being too inactive because they pressured him to fight Khamzat Chimaev. And then when that fight fell through, then it's all Leon's back in the rankings. How does that work? Patty Pimblett can soar up the rankings without fighting anybody because they want to justify the interim title shot because they know that little number next to the name, it looks all good. And here's the thing, right? People saying Kamaru Usman's not going to get the next title shot because he's ranked number 8. Don't let that fool you. Just like a fascist regime, they give you the illusion of choice of an election, and the rankings are an illusion of merit. Because especially in the Paramount era, rankings merit is dead.